Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is of course that show where that weird presenter just looks at unusual albums, just out there, ready to be heard, but just waiting to be discovered sometimes, right? So today, I think we're in for, a rather short episode of Weird Music, but that's fine. But we are looking at, a rather unusual and short little EP release that is quite odd in a lot of respects, I would say. So this whole review was written, many months ago. Like, I think it was back in the summer of 2023, and I just never got around to recording this one. But here we are. We got there in the end. This is a very odd album, but there was a slight sort of rabbit hole of sort of coincidence and discovery that has led me down, but also sort of just paving the way for things I want to talk about but wouldn't be able to make into a full video. I mean, well, one album in particular, but we will get to that later on. But also, this is just a rather unique if bizarre album experience, so let's just dive into it, shall we? Allow me to present Go by Michael Northam. So, yep, this is a very strange sounding album, isn't it? But don't worry, it will all be explained in due time. So for now, let's ask ourselves, who is Michael Northam? Well, Michael Northam, sometimes known as M. Northam, is an experimental artist from, I think, the States, whose work delves into field recordings and process to create electroacoustic improvisations whose sole purpose is to take you to a particular place and time through sound actions, in his own words. And so across his rather vast discography, Northam has created some incredibly immersive soundscapes, I would say. His compositions taking unusual electroacoustic instruments, interweaving them in amongst field recordings themselves. And it's an interesting catalogue to dive into. And today, we're starting a dive into that catalogue by having a look at the album Go, a short 20-minute drone, according to the Bandcamp, based on various sources, including spring cars themselves recorded at the Terre Haute Raceway September of 2005. This work is a monolithic testament of the force of life of a man who lived it fully until the end, as well a meditation on the Samazaric metaphor of the oval track, the circle of life we are riding along and are bound to go. And so, a strange way to introduce the only line notes, but it felt right to mention it here, I think. If you've watched any of the Steve Roden videos, you know that I like to, sometimes it's always best to just sort of discuss what text is accompanying the album, and I think this one tells us exactly what it is we need to know. An album based around, mechanization and cars and movement and stuff. And so, yeah. Go. 20-minute composition that genuinely I just find it weirdly fascinating. You listen to this and you get exactly what you would expect from the album's cover, title, and description. This is a very dense and heavy drone comprised of recordings of spring cars, as mentioned, which creates for us this very peculiar and strange listening experience that places us, right in the boot of one of these cars. Essentially, you just hear the rumbling mechanization of it as it just zooms around the track at breakneck speed. There's something just so weirdly delightful and, incredibly strange about it, I should say, as it progresses. You're sort of getting, these weird, almost rusty creaks from the springs and the mechanisms deep within the car. as well as the sound of other vehicles zooming past faster and faster, it feels, But what's oddly fascinating, as a result of all of this culminating together, is this this peculiar rising build-up in the momentum of this particular track, which is, I would say it's actually quite subtle to begin with, but it slowly just climbs and climbs the more the track progresses, and it starts to incorporate different droning layers, of processed field recordings, I'd say, that still continue that incredible pacing of the track. But it sort of helps to shift our perception of it, very gradually, I would say. And I find it's a little over the halfway point of this track, that it suddenly starts to turn as this swirling miasma of cars, everything rattling and rumbling as it forces itself to, to just accelerate further and further down the racetrack. Before we're then joined by this really weird and unusual micro sound layer that's, oddly high pitched, I would say, It's almost sort of like, one of the electronics themselves is just starting to go faulty as the car is maybe being pushed to its absolute limits, maybe? Who knows? But even then, the track just further pushes and pushes itself, as it has been doing this entire time, becoming louder and louder, more tumultuous, more crazy, more esoteric as we push ourselves, faster and faster, pushing the car to its absolute limits and just going at absolute breakneck speed, it feels. And before you know it, you start getting drowned in this really peculiar dirge of rising noisy layers that build and build on top of each other, bringing the track to this very intimidating yet fascinating and exhilarating climax, it feels. And I find it quite fascinating, truth be told, that the build-up has brought us to this very absurd place almost. Even within that miasmic deluge of rising drones, the acceleration just continues to build up and up, intertwining everything into this fantastically chaotic noise. It's weird, because from the very beginning of this track, that build-up is rather subtle, it feels. It's present, but it feels quite subtle in terms of how that acceleration is going, if that makes sense. But it's rather exciting to listen to as it just all unfolds. And you just sort of, if you just listen to it, you sort of let yourself discover exactly what it's trying to do across the 20-minute runtime. It's very interesting, I find, but so weird and bizarre. And so, that is essentially Go by Michael Northam. To be honest, I thought this was a very strange album indeed, and although this episode won't be as long as a lot of the albums we've been looking at, I've been covering the channel, I still think it was worth just taking a little dive into it because it's such an unusual and unique little album experience, and I think some of you will find it quite interesting. But to give us a little bit more to talk about, as mentioned earlier, I imagine one or two of you might actually be asking this. I mean, I'd hope so anyway. How on earth did I find this album, and why did I want to cover it exactly? Well, in terms of finding it, the answer is rather simple. And so I wrote down a month ago. This was a month ago before writing this one, so this is about half a year ago by now, I'd say. Around the time I discovered this album, before discovering this one, I came across a small EP recorded by Steve Roden. Steve Roden in forms of paper, of course. This EP, titled Ecstasy Showered Its Petals with the Full Peal of the Bells, which is a peculiar little album that even has a typo on the physical copy, which is a little shame, but alas, mistakes happen. This is probably also an album that we will be covering in our little mini-series we're doing on Steve Roden, but we will get to it another day. In any case, after discovering this particular album, I then went and checked out the very record label it was released on, Fern's Recordings. And within their strange little discography, I came across Michael Northam's Go and found it to be a very strange album indeed. So, of course, listening to it, discovering a 20-minute drone of, accelerating cars and stuff, a bit weird, but why did I want to cover it then? And so to answer that takes us to another album. The album that I did discover, I discovered through the record label Touch Records, which is a label we briefly discussed in another episode on Film Niblock, Nothing to Look At, Just a Record. And so within touch Records' very vast discography of very experimental works, there was a little album that caught my eye when I was first discovering the record label. Santa Pod, which is a very loud, intense field recording released in 1999, comprised of recordings of the Santa Pod Raceway. And this release, it would be very interesting to discuss in a future episode on Weird Music, but, as a sort of joke, I don't think it qualifies for the channel because it does state clearly on the cover, "Do not mistake this compact disc for a musical product." In any case, this really weird album, Santa Pod, has always been in the back of my mind since discovering it because it's such a unique little listening experience. This audio experience, essentially, of really loud, intense field recordings. And it's not something very pleasant to listen to because I find the noises very overloading to listen to. But when I then discovered Michael Northam's Go, what I then sort of discovered from it's perhaps an experimentation of what the kind of things you could achieve with recordings very much like the ones on Santa Pod, which I found very interesting, to be fair, and as a result I thought this would be a very good way to discuss that album briefly and discuss this little album, Go, by Michael Northam, because it's just a very unique, weird album, isn't it? Of course, this has given me a whole chance to talk about a whole bunch of different things all at once, essentially, which makes it very weird as a review and stuff, but I just thought it was a very strange little story, and it's just a sort of a story of how, as a sort of discoverer of music and discoverer of albums, if that makes sense, you can end up on these really weird little rabbit holes, and you can just go down these weird avenues and just end up discovering the most peculiar and unusual of things. And as a result of all these odd little coincidences and just discovering stuff, discovered this album that we've looked at today. This 20-minute album that just places you in the middle of a raceway with all these cars zooming past. A deluge of motion. Very unique, but as you know, I adore things that are unique. I love it when you get an album experience that just places you in this very particular place that is unique unto itself, it feels, and hence why I wanted to talk about it, essentially. And so, I think with that, we've come to the end of today's, incredibly bizarre and weird episode of Weird Music, right? Certainly a strange episode with how this narrative of sorts has played out, right? But I just thought it was something very interesting, at least to me at the very least, and also just funny how all this whole thing turned out, And so with that, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Weird Music. Feel free to check out Go by Michael Northam. The link is in the description below, of course. And check out all the other albums as well that I've mentioned. The links will also be in the description if you want to listen to the Santa Pod field recordings, or even the very unusual Steve Roden album, which we'll be covering in a future episode, definitely. It is on the agenda. But yeah, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.